Thank you, and thanks you all for getting up early with us for day two. We're here to talk about demographics and identity politics, how the changing face of America is changing American politics. And those issues, I think, have rarely been more front and center in our politics than they are right now, particularly with President Trump centering so much of his messaging and argument and coalition on debating, really, who is a legitimate American? What does America look like? What does a more diverse America look like? Who wins, who loses? All of those kinds of questions are being addressed in the political debate and on the front pages and on newscasts to a greater extent than really at any point, I think, that I've been covering politics, at least since the 1980s. So we're here to talk about a lot of different dimensions of this and to give you some of the thinking of this terrific panel on ways that you can bring these big, broad trends and big, jagged fissures to life in your own reporting. We're going to talk in a couple of minutes about the phrase identity politics and what it means and what it should mean. But I want to start by circling back to where I started, which is these questions of American identity, as I say, are certainly front and center in the political debate in many different ways at this point. And James, let me start with you and just kind of work down the panel. When you think about how to bring these issues to life for your readers at this point, what feel to you like the most important stories to illuminate?
Well, first and foremost, I think that something that's important to me is that, like, while some of these issues are fairly new, we've been having the same basic debate since, 1781. Like, the election of 1800 was in part centered on issues of identity, and was also an election in which everyone yelled at each other about personal issues, so go look that up. But I think that when I'm thinking about how to talk about these particular issues, I think I really want to center the people who are most impacted by them. And I think that there's, the notion that non-white Americans or Americans who are part of different demographic groups are, we think of these groups sometimes as kind of, monolithic in a sense, when that's never been true. And I think that it's really important to center not just, to center the people within these groups as individuals when we write about them. Because I think that there is a tendency to think about, when we talk about, say, voting trends among African Americans, something I've been really interested in is, I write predominantly about conservatism, and I went and saw Tucker Carlson speak a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking a lot about how, conservatives can do a ton of outreach to working class black men. And there was a lot of agreement. And my first thought was what about working class black women? And people are well aware that black women vote in a very different way in general than black men do. But the exact reasonings for that, it seems to be the kind of thing where we're like, well, that's the thing and we're all moving on. But the exact intricacies of how people who are, united by both class and race, but divided by gender, and how those specific intersections work in the real world, I think is something that I would love to see. I'm trying to think about how I'm going to write about that, and I would love to see other people write about the intricacies of these interrelationships, even within demographic groups. I hate it when people are just like, well, this is what African Americans think, because I don't remember it coming up at our last meeting. And, I think that there's a way to do this respectfully without just kind of being like, these 3 million people, what do they all think?
Yeah, and by the way, you could, thinking about even a group as big as white women, you could say united by gender and race and divided by class.
Right.
So between the huge gap between college and non-college and how they vote. Freddie?
I mean, pretty much the same thing when it comes to the Hispanic vote. I think every time there's an election, there's this, why didn't they turn out or why didn't they vote mostly Democratic? But it's a very complex group. You have obviously the Florida crowd, and then you have the Southwest vote, but also it's very much divided by generations. And what we're seeing is, especially, I cover the border, I cover Mexico. But what we're seeing on the border is really how immigration, how border security is becoming the big issue, and is going to help define, in many ways, the Hispanic vote. And you would think that what the president or an administration sort of using the border as a piñata, that would rile up the Hispanic vote in greater numbers, and it has. I mean, I think we saw that with the Senate race last time in Texas. But it's not monolithic at all. I mean, a lot of it depends on generations, on class, et cetera. So one of the things that we're looking at very carefully is to what extent will immigration mobilize new voters to the polls. I mean, it's too early. The projections right now is 33 million. It'll be bigger than the African American vote. But again, will they show up to vote?
So I'm not a journalist and certainly don't want to prescribe how you all should cover things. But I think when we talk about identity politics, to Jane's point, it is super important that we understand when you're voting, you're electing someone to represent you, and so you are looking for a thread of, does this person reflect who I am or the things that I care about? And that has been evolving since the beginning of the country, because we used to only need to consider, white men, only needed to consider other white men and how they reflected them, and then we had, the types of people voting have been expanding. And in this moment, I think what we're doing is just acknowledging that the electorate is not as much of a monolith as it has been in the past. And I don't love the phrase, because I think it's being weaponized a little bit, and I think that's something to be aware of. Like the words identity politics are being used to try to criticize the fact that we are paying more attention to different groups. We're saying to them, we see you, we understand that you think of yourself in a different way than this person thinks of themselves, and I think are really trying to understand how people take the wholeness of who they are and bring it to these decisions about who should represent them. And that is very different, if you are a Black woman in an urban area, taking care of parents that are aging, versus a 19-year-old white woman in LA, in Santa Monica. And I think that we just need to consider the fullness of who we're talking about these days.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that in one moment. Let me stick with you and ask you. 2020 is a milestone. It's the first time that there will be a larger share of the eligible voting population will be millennials than baby boomers for the first time ever in a presidential race. And then there are several points more that are whatever we're calling post-millennials, just for argument's sake for the next 20 minutes, of the generation behind them. And it will be the first time. The baby boom has been the largest generation of eligible voters for 40 years, which is almost unprecedented in American history. What do you think are the most important things for reporters to keep in mind as this transition is happening? We've talked about how you can't paint any group with a single brush. What do you think people need to be thinking about, and what are kind of the ways they can bring to life this historic generational transition?
I think the number one thing is probably millennials hate to be called millennials. Yeah. I'm only going to assume the post-millennial generation will also hate being described as something tangential to millennials. It's a huge group of people in this country. There's almost 100 million millennials coming of age. It's also a really big swath. So I'm a millennial. I'm the person who didn't have internet their whole life, but got it when I was fairly young. And you have people who have never known anything but to have an iPhone in their hands, or an iPad, and working their way through the internet. And so I think this is a large group of individuals. The consistency amongst them is that there's always been a fairly deep distrust of institutions and a deep skepticism of the people representing us in government. And so participation rates have been pretty low consistently for this generation, and we're seeing a sort of awakening, and that's happening across all age groups right now. But you have young people participating at historic rates in 2018, going from 20% of the 20% turnout to 31% turnout, which we should also keep in mind is still 70% of the generation not showing up to vote. But I think that the thing I would also keep in mind about covering them is that these are, a lot of them are first-time voters in 2020, and it is I think we talk about people who don't vote a lot of times as, this group of people that's either super underinformed or lacking information about participating. And we have a huge generation of people who have had the most access to information of any human in entire history, making concerted, fairly conscious decisions not to participate. And I think the way that we approach trying to make this more accessible and more interesting and encourage people to vote, that's what I do, is acknowledging some of the systemic failures that they've had to encounter and deal with.
Do you think there is a generational story that needs to be told?
I think so. I'm also a millennial. I think first and foremost, I think when we talk about millennials, there's this idea that millennials are 19 years old. I'm 31.
Right.
I get tired around 9:30. Sometimes, granted, I'm a very tired person, but I do think that there's a sensibility, for a lot of people within our generation, our first main cogent memory is 9/11, which took place the second week of my freshman year of high school. And then, the kind of financial collapse took place my senior year of college. So in some ways, kind of these major milestones of my academic career were bookended by awful, terrible things happening. And I think that there's a sensibility, when people are I know that they get a lot of clicks, but the trend story is about why aren't millennials buying diamonds? And I'm no, because we don't have money. Mm-hmm. Or if we have money, we're not going to spend it on a rock. And so I think that there's this, there's something to be said for kind of a generation. Now, I also want to be really clear that when we talk about generations, that the generation itself is the only unifying characteristic here, mm-hmm. because we are talking, Mark Zuckerberg is a millennial. I'm a millennial. We have nothing else in common. And so I do think that there's a sense that, there are some commonalities. I think that being very uncertain about the future and being a lot more cautious. There's been a lot of reporting about how millennials aren't having sex anymore, and it's just well, we're tired and there's a lot going on. Mm. But I think that the uncertainty that a lot of people within our generation, not just necessarily feeling right now, but something that we grew up with, just this constant, the catastrophizing of our lives that's been taking place since 2001, and for many people even earlier, with kind of the housing crisis and the financial crisis, and just kind of and let's not forget the many people of my generation who have served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've been at war since I was a freshman in high school. And I think that those are some unifying aspects to, when people are kind of, when you hear about journalists asking questions of why is this generation interested in isolationism? Why is this generation somewhat interested in democratic socialism? And you're just why wouldn't they be? Why wouldn't, based on our experiences as a generation, why would we not be intrigued by the idea of not going to war in countries we don't live in? And, finding an economic system that we think that might be potentially more fair to the individual than the current system we have right now. Now, whether or not that's correct or not, I think that that's something worth contemplating about, putting millennials into their proper context, recognizing that for a lot of people, yes, we have, we're the beneficiary of centuries of building and success within this country, but also we have been, the last 20 years of our lives in many senses have been a very anxious 20 mm-hmm. years. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's worth kind of coming to terms with and really focusing on putting this generation in its proper context.
I'll come back to that in a second. But Alfredo, let me ask you, because you talked, you mentioned the generational differences in the Latino population in Texas that we saw. Talk about, what do you think are the fundamental dividing lines in perspective? Is it mostly a different economic experience, or is it different assessments of kind of where these communities fit into the broader country?
I mean, there's always the question of, where do we fit in? How do we fit into this country? It's a population that's constantly changing, replenishing itself through immigration. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, it's still very much economics. I mean, the sense of inequality. Yes, immigration plays a huge role, but it wasn't surprising for me to see that in the early polling, someone like Bernie Sanders has the majority of the Hispanic vote, followed, I think, by Biden and then O'Rourke. Julian Castro, who's the only Latino in the race, was at 4%. So there is that sense of, we just want to be able to move up the ladder, to be able to obtain basic education, get a job, a good paying job. But there are, I think the term socialism is something that's interesting and really divides Latinos. In the Southwest versus, say, the Southeast, the Florida group, and that's something that I see from covering immigration. You use the word socialism, and it's a whole different sense of aspirations and fears, if you will.
Yeah. Let me stick with you for another question, which is certainly, very clear signals from Donald Trump that he is going to constantly find ways to turn attention back to the border between now and the election. I mean, even the reports this morning about busing undocumented immigrants and dropping them off in downtown San Francisco or other cities that have enacted sanctuary city laws. There's probably going to be an infinite, procession of these kinds of ideas between now and 2020, especially after the DHS purge. As people are covering the debate about the border between now and 2020, what do they need? What are the biggest misconceptions about what is happening on the border? What do people need to keep in mind about what the real story is? And where do they go for information?
I mean, it's certainly not an emergency. If it was an emergency, I don't think I'd be here this morning. Mm-hmm. It's certainly a humanitarian crisis on the border. I mean, and I think people have to understand that the basic profile has changed. It's no longer single Mexican males coming in as they did during my father's generation or many generations. Mexican men who would come in, they'd be apprehended, and then within 24 hours, they were sent back to Mexico. We are now talking about entire families or parents traveling with a daughter or a son. The numbers, it was 76,000 in February. I think that's just the numbers that came out yesterday or the day before, something like 92,000. The federal government calls it record numbers, and they are record numbers, and it's the highest numbers in 10, 12 years. But it's certainly nothing compared to the old Mexican migration. I mean, the 1.6 million people who came back in 2000. The president has already made 3 trips to the border this year. It's clear that immigration generating fear helped them in 2016, and it's going to be the same playbook that we're seeing. But I think what's interesting to watch is to what extent what other cruel measures can he come up with? We saw separation of families. 2 weeks ago, they had migrants underneath the international bridge, caged up. It's almost like animals at a circus. We had the federal government come in. They had the CPB commissioner do a press conference, and then the Border Patrol CPB was, they were taking reporters, almost walking them across and say, we thought this might be an interesting picture. So it's the optics. And I think as journalists, we have to be careful not to use these people as the administration does as pawns. We have to be mindful of their dignity and integrity. I mean, it was really I can't think of another word than heartbreaking to see people being used in this way. I mean, many of them were sick, and I remember interviewing some people and say, well, the government says we're sick, that we bring diseases. Well, of course we do. They put you under a cage. You're sleeping on gravel. There's wind. So I think as we get closer and closer to 2020, we're going to see a lot more of that. And I think as reporters, we have to be mindful that while the administration is using them as pawns, we have to humanize the issue as much as we can.
And to do that requires what? Telling people's individual story? I mean, what's the response?
Individual stories. I mean, obviously, it helps a lot if you speak the language. Being able to find access to them. I mean, I think the story is not just on the border. I think if we focus just on the border, we're really missing a big part of the story. I mean, the story is in Chicago, the story is in New York, because on the border, they're there 48 hours, 72 hours, and then they're gone. And these communities, I think it's important to follow up, try to find a way to find trust with them, find access. I'm curious, I mean, this has been happening for years. I mean, what happened to these kids who came in 2008, 2009, 2014? We know what's happening to them. If you go to Central America and you tell people this is what you're going to expect, if you cross the border, yet they will do it because they don't see people being returned immediately. So if migrants can stay 2-3 years here, they can maybe save enough money to pay off the smugglers. I mean, they're paying $6,000 to get to the United States. So I think a big part of the story that I'm missing as a border journalist is really what's happening in the interior. What's happening once they get here? What's happening not just to them but to their children? Yeah,
and I think Jane, this takes us to the other half of our title, identity politics, and what qualifies. What is our definition of identity politics? Certainly, Trump has given every indication that, as we were saying, that he views a hard line on immigration as central to the messaging he wants to pursue in 2020. We have a lot of people talking about, well, are Democrats engaging in, quote, identity politics by emphasizing turnout among various growing groups? Trump is certainly engaging in a form of identity politics of his own.
So, I think if anyone here follows me on Twitter, that one of my main hobby horses is that basically all politics is in itself a form of identity politics. Because in my view, identity politics is just the idea of, different groups. And it doesn't have to be based on race or sexual orientation or gender identity. It could also be, there are identity groups that are based on, something that people kind of engage in. And I'd give the example of thinking about guns and gun issues. I think that if there is a group of people for whom a particular issue matters more than it might matter for another group of people, I think in some ways that itself is a form of identity. And I'm thinking about identity politics, and I think that the idea that there's a way of doing politics in which we don't do that. And I think that there's been a sense, you see this from some Democrats and folks on the left that we could have this conversation about, working class Americans without resorting to identity politics. And I said, you're aware that working class Americans is itself an identity group. When we talk about that, who are we talking about? I use the example, I talked to conservatives about kind of the concept of conservative populism. They're like, I don't think either Republicans or Democrats are doing enough for normal people. And when you're asked to define what normal people means, you find yourself on a magical journey. But I think that these ideas that this is, that identity politics is in many ways just the practice of politics in everyday life. When we are thinking about how a particular issue, something I think we don't talk about enough in general is, how our military has changed and shifted, and how the military lifestyle is now just that, a lifestyle. It's something that, if you're a military spouse, you're like, where you move, how that's funded, where you move to, your community, kind of the basic inner workings of that are very different from what they looked like, when we had a draft, or what that would look like when military service was something engaged in by more members of the American population. And so I think that in some ways that's an identity issue that I don't think we're talking about enough. But I think that when we hear kind of identity politics, and that's only used to talk about issues about race and gender, for one thing, that flattens millions of people and turns people into kind of like, yes, you're an African American woman. Why wouldn't this appeal to you? Or, you're a white working class man who lives in a specific city. Why wouldn't this particularly appeal to you? But I think something we saw in 2018 was how these issues, how Democrats and Republicans kind of shifted around on these particular issues, because I think that there's a sense, you heard before, you mentioned previously how Trump was used immigration in 2016, but in 2018, a lot of Democrats responded by saying, by kind of saying like, okay, we're going to have these conversations, but we're also going to have conversations about issues that members of identity groups also care about, like healthcare, and I think that there's a sense that when we talk about identity politics, for one thing, I think we're flattening people, but we're also not talking about a lot of the issues that are unifying in some senses. And they're unifying in different ways, and we can really dive into the context of those. But I think that to just resort to calling any politics that impacts one group of people differently than another group of people as identity politics is a ruse.
Well, it's interesting because there is a kind of recoil from the phrase, as you were alluding to, on both sides. Republicans reject the idea that what they are doing, certainly in the Trump era, what they are doing is a form of identity politics.
Which is adorable.
Right,
just
right.
Adorable.
And as you note, there are people on the left who say, well, no, like class is the real divide, when in fact there is an enormous gap in the political attitudes and preferences of people at the same income and education level who are white or not. I mean, it's and I think certainly kind of in the Sanders side of the Democratic Party is a belief that if you are tough enough on Wall Street, you will overcome Trumpian cultural appeals to kind of working class. I mean, that there is some level of economic populism that trumps cultural affinity or resentment, depending on how you want to put it.
And I think one thing that we don't ask...
Which may not be true.
Right. One thing we don't ask enough is why? And I think as journalists, that should be our first question. For you just mentioned, like, people, African Americans and white Americans vote differently, even when, same gender, same class, same, even
education
same
level.
job, same education level, same financial level of success or non-success. Why? What is, when we talked about the Alabama special election, with Roy Moore versus Doug Jones, there was a lot of conversation of like, like black women really showed up here. Why? What, and then the other conversation with that particular special election is Republican women were just like, I'm out, I don't want to do this. And we didn't really ask, okay, why this particular time? I think to some people, Roy Moore would be such an obvious person to not want to support, and yet some people did. And I think that getting beyond just the fact of the matter of how African American women vote differently than African American men, and not pursuing kind of the why? What conversations are we not having when we're not asking why?
Well, actually, let me ask you, because there is, I think, a lot of evidence that over roughly the last 30 years or so, culture has trumped class in driving voting behavior, and that people's attitudes toward the demographic and cultural changes that we're living through are a really good predictor of where they end up. Between the two coalitions. There's lots of polling, for example, that there are lots of Republican or conservative women who are uneasy about changing gender roles. It's like there's as we were talking about, there's nothing that's uniform. It's not like all women have the same view about the changing role of women. So my question is, people look at the millennial generation and say, okay, this is a more tolerant and inclusive generation, but it's also a more diverse. I mean, part of its defining characteristic is much more diverse than earlier generations. Over 40%, people of color. If you look only at kind of white millennials compared to older whites, or if you look at non-white millennials compared to older non-whites, are they still different?
I think The piece that we don't talk a lot about is the best predictor of where you go to vote in terms of identity is whether you're evangelical or not. And so that's a piece that, that is a largely white group of people. It's actually a better predictor than education level and class. So I think that's worth digging into. One of the things that I actually do think there are some things about this generation that do carry through, and being exposed to more cultures. It is more diverse generation. It is more tolerant. It is more oriented towards justice. And I think you see that in all of the issues that people care most about. So young people care. In this last election, gun safety was a top priority. And that is because it is impacting everybody across all of these class, race. I think one of the things that I would say as journalists is that, the Parkland students in Florida put a face on an issue that has been an issue for a lot of people for a long time. We're in Chicago. There are young people in this community who organize very regularly, aggressively to try to reduce the gun violence here in their own community. And I think that this wasn't a huge rise in awareness about this happening. 43% of young people in 2018 said that was a huge impact on how they voted in the election, and for a lot of them, the fact that they voted at all. And that's an issue that's important. It is, I think, also the Parkland students have done a good job trying to shine a light on the fact that it impacts more than just one school here or one school there. And they're solving for a problem. I think, to Jane's point, things have not been great for a long time. So you have the fear of going to school and dying. You have immigration as the second most important issue for young people. Growing up with kids who have come into the country that don't know that they are undocumented. So, DACA reform is super high on that list of priorities. And then climate change. So you have sort of three issues where young people are often described as being lazy and disinterested and not solving these problems quickly enough that an entirely different generation has created for them, and often are quite resistant to changing these things.
I've met kids within a few blocks of here, literally, who did not know they were undocumented until they had to fill out their FAFSA forms.
I mean, and it's true. And I think the other thing is we talk about the white working class as though there aren't millennials a part of that. And we also, I think there's this image that gets conjured a lot of times when we say white working class of sort of a middle-aged white man, maybe factory worker in Ohio, when we're also talking about, he goes to McDonald's on his way home and is served by a young person of color, millennial. That's also a working class person. So
right.
We don't talk about the service industry nearly.
We don't talk about the service industry enough at all.
But those two, so that goes back to my question, though. If you're talking about white working class young people, first of all, it's a smaller share of the generation than it is of the baby boomer or older generation. That's one kind of basic fact. But are they different? Are we talking about are we talking in fact about a generational change that transcends some of these other categories, or are we talking fundamentally about a racial change?
I would say it depends on where in the country. So that's a different, it depends on geography a lot of times. It depends on the community that they're living in. And, is it a carbon copy? No. Is it too similar for what I would like? Yes. I mean, we still have these attitudes. I mean, there was a good number of white young people marching in Charlottesville alongside folks.
If you look at the exit polls in 2012, Obama narrowly lost both young whites with and without a college education, narrowly lost them both. In 2016, they exploded in opposite directions. I mean, Clinton won college-educated young whites by like 20 points and lost non-college young whites by like 20 points. So they moved apart, and that's kind of part of the general, I think, polarization.
And that polarization, if you dig into that data, it is a very clear discrepancy in evangelical vote versus non. And that was very tied, I think, to the Supreme Court nomination. To the point of you should ask why, what was the reasoning behind it? That was a huge part of that.
But still, that's true. I've written about that. But non-college, non-evangelical white young people are still much more conservative. But I want to ask about a different aspect of this. Because, I mean, part of the, we're talking about kind of how politics is being shaped by the demographic transitions that the country is going through and the recoil in some quarters from that. But there are other aspects of the transition that matter. You mentioned the service industry. I want to ask about one other. I mean, the media itself, every aspect of the media, not just newspapers and magazines and websites and cable, but also movies and music. I mean, the question of who gets to tell the stories and whose stories are told is also changing enormously. We were talking about, the early 1970s and the blaxploitation movies, which was pretty much the only opportunities at that point. Alfredo, let me start with you. To what extent do you think people's personal experience, to what extent should the stories you tell be shaped by the experiences you've lived?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm an immigrant, and that's always. I mean, especially these days, in these very divided times. I write a story about immigration. I'm going to get flooded by hate mail and so forth. So there is a sense of I need to continue to prove that I'm able to tell two sides. I'm able to stay neutral. But I have enough editors that they will, vet the stories and so forth. But I'm going to write the story, and I'm going to tell the story the best way I know how. But obviously, you can't walk away from who you are. I mean, and I don't really intend to, but I do. I am determined to try to be as balanced as I can, be neutral. But at the same time, I think it helps to put a perspective, especially when it comes to the changing migrations these days. To be able to put some context of what immigration was like in the 60s and the 70s and so forth, and be able to tell it from I know what we went through. I think it helps enriches the story, and it helps the readers.
Yeah, and you think you see different stories than, say, an Anglo graduate from Ohio State who moved to Dallas, was hired to Dallas, someone who grew up living these stories.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel that, but not just feel it, but I've seen it. I mean, I see when the border. It's more than just geography. The border is a mindset, and it's always interesting to see colleagues come in, whether they parachute in, they have a story that they're going to do, but I think they miss a lot of the nuances that if you live on the border or if you live in Mexico, or if you're an immigrant yourself, it's something that's there, and it's something that a lot of people just miss. I wish I could, and other than Spanish and English, I wish I could speak a lot of the indigenous dialogues that a lot of Central Americans come in. I mean, I think I think I'm missing a big chunk of the story, because oftentimes I rely on translators to help me understand that. And I know that when we're doing that translation moment, I know that I'm missing big parts of that.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that I can't take, like you were saying, you can't really leave yourself behind. And I think that the I'll be extremely brave and call it the fetishization of objectivity, and this idea that there are these two sides and both sides are equal, are entirely equal. That's never been true. And I think that we have this idea that yes, there was this time where journalism was more fair or something. I'm like, one, that was certainly not true in the early 20th century, and especially when journalism has for a long time been very limited to a specific group of people who could practice it. When people get very excited about the 1950s and 1960s and that practice of journalism, this was also a time, even going earlier to the 1940s, in which the press basically agreed with the White House, like, we'll just never show photographs of FDR in a wheelchair. And FDR said, that sounds good to me. And we all just sat down and said, that's great. And, I think that when we're talking about objectivity, obviously there are issues of bias in the media. I write a lot about conservatism, so it's the same thing I think about a lot. But on the other hand, to attempt to both sides a lot of different issues and not really think about the people most impacted by those issues, I think is a really big mistake that we've been making and are still making today. I write a lot about the alt-right and white nationalism on the far right, and and I do this, one, because it's something I've been researching for a long time, but also I am aware that I am the fundamental worst thing in the history of the world to white nationalists. And I've had these conversations with white nationalists where they attempt to make these arguments about how, don't you think that they tell me about my parents, my dad's black, my mom is white, and these are people who are making arguments still about how mixed race marriage is evil and wrong. And I'm having these conversations with them as the product of someone of a mixed race marriage, as someone in a same gender marriage, as someone who is a part of these stories. I can't both sides that. I can't say well, you made some good points about how my parents are evil. No, that's not what I'm going to do. And I think that this idea, there is a difference between bias. There's a difference between coming into a story and saying well, I already know that these people are bad. And then, there's something to be said about, allowing yourself to ask the questions that you came into this thinking about, and really talking about the real focus of the story, which should be the people impacted by these ideas.
So given all that, how do you decide in your mind when you call something racist? When you use that word, do you use that word?
Yeah. Oh God, yeah.
And do you use it for Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the idea that that racist should be reserved for these specific conditions, and we've all agreed, and we did a polling. No, there are times where we can use this word. And I'd also note that racist and white nationalist are not interchangeable. Mm-hmm. Occasionally I've seen people kind of using that, and no, white nationalism is a specific ideology that has to do with white ethno-state, and that's a whole other thing. But I do think that this idea that racism is something we can only know if we look deep into their heart.
Right,
and I'm no, this isn't, have you given your life to Christ? This is you think this race of people is inferior to this other race of people, which is why perhaps one made reference to a specific country as being a shithole. I don't have to go deep and delve into Donald Trump's heart for that.
Because that's the argument is that, you need to know what their intent was, quote, in order to describe
This isn't a criminal trial.
Right.
So what is Trump? What
has Trump done that you've described as racist?
I think that
the shithole.
Yeah, shithole countries. I think that the Mexicans are bringing crime. I mean, I know 2015 was millions of years ago, but there was when he descended down that golden escalator, and his entire focus was how Mexican immigrants are, as a group, bad for the country.
The rapists, murderers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I also think something that was interesting is, there's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump's relationship with the alt-right, and I think a major focal point of that is, if we hearken back to 2010, 2011, Donald Trump was well aware of who both David Duke and Patrick Buchanan were. He said that Patrick Buchanan was a giant anti-Semite and a quote-unquote Hitler lover. And he was well aware of who David Duke was. And then suddenly in 2016, he just helpfully forgot. And so I think that, Donald Trump's particular racism is the kind of racism where he thinks that Ben Carson and members of the Congressional Black Caucus have already met. But I would also say that I think something that I find most insulting is Trump's assumption that the people who vote for him are as racist as he is. The idea that in order to gain support, he has to pretend he doesn't know who David Duke is. That, if I were a Trump voter, and I talk a lot to Trump voters, I would find that bananas insulting. The idea that the only way to make outreach to white working class voters is by using racist dog whistles, and sometimes just whistles.
Yeah. Well, one thing I have on Donald Trump is I have been in David Duke's house in Metairie, Louisiana.
I mean,
Dallas. I was going to say Dallas. On Dallas, Texas, when do you apply, given some of the debates we're having, when does that newspaper apply the word racist to politicians at the national or local level, groups? What does it? Do you use that word to describe any of these policies?
Have I used the word racist?
Yeah.
I don't use the word racism. I let the experts use the word racism.
But you quoted people.
I quoted people, yeah.
Calling specific policies racist.
Like people, for example, questioning or wondering, if these weren't Latin American kids, Hispanic kids, let's say they were Norwegian kids, Swedish kids, would they still be in cages? Would they still be separated from their families? I mean, that's something that's become common these days on the border. I don't necessarily, my editors would not allow me to use the word racism, but I mean, I think there are plenty of experts out there who are just dying to say that.
Mm-hmm. And what's the reaction you get when that accusation appears?
Go back to Mexico.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. There has been polling. I'm interested in your. There's been polling that has found different questions in different organizations, somewhere like between 65, sometimes 75% of millennials, people born after 1980, have said they consider Trump either racially biased or racist. When you try to motivate young people to vote, is that something you want to say or not? Or is it mobilizing or demobilizing?
Depends on who you're talking to. And I think that, from a journalism perspective, first of all, I think it's 8 a.m., we're here. What all of you are about to do or have been doing is so important, and to do it in this moment where your profession is being denigrated by the President of the United States on a regular basis, and to try to speak truth to what's going on is so important. And also to your earlier question, and I'll come back to this, but if you don't tell the truth, we live in an age where everyone has their own platform to speak and wants their story told and wants their perspective told. They will make that so. And I think that that's the interesting opportunity here. So for me, it doesn't matter if I want to use that term to motivate certain people. I'm just watching for what is motivating people to turn out and where the narrative is. And it's not hard to see what the conversation is on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and understand where people are at in any given moment.
And so how important a motivator is it, that perception, do you think?
I think in 2020, it will be important. Yeah. I think there's a lot around the racist term. I think people are afraid to be called that now, and especially in younger generations, and are watching for moments to make sure that they're not doing it. I think the left has a real challenge with not over-policing language. Because appealing to people.
A couple of weeks ago, Stacey Abrams said to our friend who was name checked several times yesterday, Dan Baltz at the Post, she said, Donald Trump is a racist, xenophobic, misogynist, homophobe. Mm-hmm. And after she said it, just 4 words, boom. I talked to a number of Democratic consultants and got enormously mixed opinions about whether Democrats want to describe him in those terms. Whether it is not whether it was correct, but whether they wanted to use that language, whether that would be more mobilizing or off-putting.
Well, the Democratic Party is split right now amongst consultants on which group we should be going after to help defeat this person. And I really think this is the water that the nominee needs to carry. And set the tone on. And, the young people right now, Bernie Sanders, it's the same as Hispanic. Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke are polling at the highest levels. And I think that it's a disservice to credit that solely to name recognition and to not acknowledge that some of the people who are speaking most plainly about the situation we're in are appealing to young people who will cut through the bullshit in the fastest way possible. The bullshit meter on young people who grew up in this need to be able to filter information out and spin out quickly is high. So that's the other thing, and as you think about approaching.
Bring in the audience a bit, but it sounds like on balance you think that Democrats should use that language rather than not.
I think Democrats should be calling, I think everyone should be calling out appropriately where there are discriminatory behaviors. I think there was, you saw the country unite behind the Muslim ban. You saw the country unite, it's certainly not united about the wall necessarily, but the caging of children at the border. You have these moments where there is a pretty robust response that cuts across generations and across party lines.
Okay, I think do we have the, can't really see if the mic is, oh, there's the mic. The mic is there, yeah. So if anybody's got a question, come on up. Or come on back if you're starting in the front.
Good morning. Andy Shane with the Post and Courier in Charleston. The word evangelical is, I think, a little amorphous. How do you all see that definition? Obviously, coming from the South, it's a big thing, and of course, obviously was a issue with in 2016 with the idea of the backing that Trump got. But how do you when we do polls and we do this kind of thing, we ask you to identify yourself as evangelical? I am not really sure that even folks down south, obviously, and obviously whether it's in LA or New York or in Chicago, know exactly what that means. How do you take that definition? I'd like to hear that.
So I think for me, I think that that's something, this goes to my point, I've made it before, that I think that journalists need to get better about talking about communities of faith in general, because I've seen people who have conflated mainline Protestantism with evangelicals, it's a different group. And I also think that when people talk about church-going Americans and don't talk about the black church, whether or not those are people who are AME members or whether or not those are just African-American Catholics, like my late grandmother, I think we're doing a disservice. So when I'm thinking about evangelicals, I am thinking about people who think of themselves as being evangelicals. Something I find interesting is the polling data on how Trump performed, not necessarily with just evangelicals, but evangelicals who don't go to church, but who think of themselves as culturally evangelical. And I think that the evangelical movement has a really long history in the United States. We've seen this a number of times, and kind of how these communities have formed. But I think of when we're talking about evangelicals, I'm thinking of a group that is not, do not think of themselves as mainline Protestants. We're not talking Methodists or Presbyterians. They certainly are not Catholics, and we could get into a whole different discussion on that alone. But I think of, evangelicals as being a separate group of, self-professing Christians who are part of an evangelical tradition, which has a lot to do with kind of, really trying to gather people towards, in their view, towards Jesus Christ, for whom that's really important, for whom that kind of the evangelical message of kind of go out to all the nations is of primary importance.
Every religious denomination, the more often you attend services, the more Republican you vote. It's true for every single one, mainline Protestant, evangelical, Catholic, Jewish, in terms of studying the political behavior of evangelicals, I think it is largely the self-identification that people have relied on. There's a variety of different, obviously the exit poll is kind of a big one, but Pew does really big religious affinity surveys, as does Public Religion Research Institute, which is a great resource for people. And they all rely on some kind of self-identification. And that's pretty much what we're stuck with at this point.
Hi, my name is Tom Powell. I'm a local news anchor in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for the NBC affiliate. Jane, when you said I can't both sides that, I really related to that, especially when I was covering the marriage debate.
Right.
And I'm talking to politicians, and I'm sitting there and I'm biting my tongue because I don't see two sides personally, and they'll say something that is personally hurtful. Is it appropriate to, when you're reporting these issues, to be honest about who you are, or are you, when you're a journalist, do you just put all of that aside?
No, because I think that even if you are not necessarily being honest, I think that I'm also I'm a queer person, and it's great. Marriage is great. Marriage equality was great. It all worked out. But I think that I have a lot of times in which people are talking to me in a different way than they would be talking to someone else about these particular issues. A lot of times, I've had fairly prominent conservatives who are telling me, well, I just love Al Sharpton, and I'm like, do you think I would love Al Sharpton? Because that's raises some new questions. So I do think it's important to be honest. Specifically in the issues of marriage equality, where I've seen this weird kind of like erasure of everything that happened before June 26, 2015, as if we were all dead back then. And you see that the arguments people were making with regard to marriage equality, when they had to make those arguments to a gay person, that they really, and you and I both remember this, when the marriage equality was winding its way through the courts back in 2014, you saw people attempting to make the argument, well, gay people don't want to get married. Or, what about civil unions or something like that? When you told them, I'm a gay person, and how are you going to make sense of this to me? Whereas to other heterosexual people who they kind of thought that they had more kinship with, you saw a very different set of arguments with regard to same-sex marriage about, what'll it do to heterosexual marriage? What'll it do to children? Because, if children see people getting married, that would be bad. So, and, I think that I think is important to just be when you can call someone out on the carpet about I am impacted by your viewpoints, make the argument for your viewpoints to the person who is most impacted by them.
So you're saying as a journalist, you can put that out on the table during an interview?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that it's also important because sometimes when we take everything at the 30,000-foot view, the debate over marriage equality became something this is all about the law and civics and things like that. And you're no, it's about me. It's about me and you and a lot of other people. And you need to be able to make the argument against marriage equality to me. And that's what I'm going to make you do.
Let's go. Got a few online.
Hi, I'm Oren Oppenheim. I'm a deputy news editor for the Chicago Maroon, incoming summer intern at the Philly Inquirer. Early on in your panel, you guys spoke a bit about the millennials and the millennial vote. But I wanted to ask about the younger generation, Generation Z, which, to be clear, full disclosure, I'm a member of that generation. It means a lot to me. But I'm wondering, what do you think the impact of Generation Z and the divides between groups within Generation Z will have on the 2020 election, especially because some members of Generation Z, this will be their first election. For others, it's their second or third. It's my third election that I'll be voting in, and my second presidential election. So how do you think that'll affect 2020, or will it?
Depending on the definition of Generation Z, it cannot be your third. Generation Z started in '96, so could it be that's the earliest version of it. So could it be your third election? That would be 24, I guess.
If you've got some municipals in
could be second. Yeah. Could be the second, I guess.
No, but second presidential election.
Yeah, second presidential, right. We know that something like 4% or 5% of eligible voters, I think, 5 or 6% of eligible voters will be, and there are different definitions of when the generations cut off. Pew has a 1996 line. Other people have a 2000 line. Do you see significant differences between, people born from 1980 to 2000, say, and people born after?
I think, the generational lines are not hard and fast. Obviously, right. They're kind of fluid. I think that even though for a lot of these very young people, this is their first election, for a lot of 30-year-olds, this is their first election, too, that they'll be participating in, because we've gone through this pretty long period of low participation. All indications are turnout will be high in 2020. People are paying attention. There's energy. We've gone through a few spikes in history like this. Highest voter participation amongst young people was 1972, when 18-year-olds had gotten the right to vote. We had a spike from 88 to 92, and then 2000 to 2004, when the Iraq War was the big issue. Clearly, this is a sort of choose your own adventure about what the big issue is in 2020, but there are a lot of them. I think that keeping in mind that people coming into this process for the first time are doing so in a system that is complicated and confusing and totally decentralized, right? If you said you're going to be in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania election administration is totally different from Illinois, is totally different from Oregon and Washington, it's like election day in Washington state is not a single day, it is a month because you have your ballots at home with you. They've been mailed out, there's early vote periods, and I think that trying to do what you can to debunk the myth of how hard it is to participate, or at least arming people with the information they need in order to get out there is helpful. And keeping in mind that it is an intimidating process to get into for the first time where you haven't grown up participating. Going to a polling booth and trying to navigate through that process is just, it's intimidating. And there, one thing I like to tell people, there's an election protection hotline, 866 Our Vote. It's a nonprofit in DC. And one of the things they saw spike after 2016 heading into the 2018 election was the number of people calling, not to ask where their polling place was, but to ask what they should wear to the polling place. And I think it's because culturally, like if you came from a family that voted and took you with, you went with them, you knew that it was a thing you did after grocery store or picking up from school or whatever, you know what that was. There is a whole group of people that's not sure, I mean, is it like jury duty? Am I supposed to wear a suit? Like, I don't understand how to do this. And I think the more that you can investigate what are the things holding people back and helping to make that a much easier process to get involved in, the better. And I think that is a unique thing to this young generation because the rules have changed so much. There's been so many shifts in election administration, and because the older generation that we've been born to, there were fewer people taking us along with them to vote.
Don't even get them started on a caucus. I mean, that's like, yeah, next.
Hi, good morning. My name is Natalie Yar. I work for the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. And I read an interesting editorial in the New York Times about a year ago. It was, I think, called Stop Pretending Black Midwesterners Don't Exist, or
Amen.
something like that. And I'm curious about, and this is much of what the person brought up in their editorial, but about the use of the term working class to talk about white voters. And I can understand that it's to differentiate the elite from white voters from the other people who are going to vote in a different way. But I'm curious about what it suggests to people when we don't hear people talked about as Black working class or Latino working class, when we know those are enormous sectors of the population. And also, how do we give an excuse to people in a certain way for, like, oh, they just feel that way, they have racial anxiety because they're working class, as if other people didn't also have economic anxiety in addition to being Black and Latino and things like that.
Right. Well, by the way, I mean, I think we have gotten to a point where I think most coverage now refers to the white when they're talking about the white working class, I think they say, and they certainly should say, white working class, because as we were talking about before, people who are have utterly the same economic and even educational backgrounds, their voting behavior diverges enormously on whether they are white or not. So, I mean,
Right, but are we talking about Black folks as Black working class folks when a large part of the Black population is probably working class?
It is,
Right, exactly. And I think that there's something to be said about how when we went, after 2016, when everyone had to go to a diner and talk to Trump voters about something, because that's where you would find them, not as if, like, I also think there are Trump voters in cities and urban areas, and we don't talk about why they voted the way they did. We could go on for a long time. But, like, I do think that there's also a sensibility of when we're talking about the white working class, we're even limiting what jobs we're thinking of as being working class. You know, I remember there were some really interesting articles before the 2016 election about efforts to get out the vote among service industry employees who work in hotels, for example, in Nevada. Especially because Nevada is a fascinating political environment, and we saw that a little bit in 2018 as well. But we don't think of that as being working class, because I think we've separated out, the service industry, and we think of working class, as Donald Trump going to West Virginia to talk to coal miners. And it's a very distinct form of what working class means, when what actually working class means is that, there are people who are working in the service industry, there are people who are working, the people who are taking out the garbage here in this building, that's working class. And we're not talking, I think we're really doing a disservice when we're not talking about issues impacting the Black working class and Latino working class Americans, because clearly everyone in this group is dealing with economic anxiety. Only one of these groups dealt with it in a particular way by voting for a particular person. Why?
And Alfredo, you were talking about before about how even in the Hispanic community in Texas, healthcare will prioritize above immigration in terms of what voters are focused.
Right. And even on the issue of immigration, I mean, when you talk to the Latino working class, there is some angst, there is some pushback on too much immigration. I mean, it's not monolithic, but it's interesting to see, when politicians say, we're going to mobilize the Latino vote because of immigration. But I think in some form, I mean, there is also a pushback.
But by the way, just one kind of just practical point is that the gap in voting behavior among whites by education is much larger than among Hispanics or African Americans. I mean, it's just an empirical. I mean, there are differences, but they're not nearly as pronounced as a 20-something point gap in Trump's support among college and non-college whites. It doesn't compare. It's not nearly as big among the other groups.
Hey, how are you? My name is Renzo Roof. I cover U.S. politics for Swiss newspapers out of D.C. A question about history. Is it instructive when you write about immigration and immigration policies to look back what happened in this country for the last 100 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I think, imperative to give some kind of history as to why the immigration flows. I mean, especially Central America. I mean, there's been previous U.S. conflicts in Central America. And the Bracero program of the 1940s and the 1950s. I think, even in today's journalism, when 800 words, 900 words, I mean, you have to have that paragraph or two to kind of try to put things in historical context in order for the reader to really understand. I mean, it's not a new phenomena. This is a fickle country in many ways. They take you in one generation and then they want to deport you to the next generation.
And there are a lot of parallels to the last time there was a significant push to, particularly legal immigration, was the 1920s, when you had the biggest urban-rural divide until our time. 1920 was the first census when the urban population exceeded the rural population in the country. And what followed after that, and also the aftermath of World War II, was isolationism, protectionism, and kind of shutting off immigration in 1924. And there was, all of those things came at once in the same way that they are now.
I would just add, as it relates to young people, that you have to keep in mind civic education has been cut in most schools around the country, and the way we teach history doesn't always get at the instant recall. So contextualizing all of today is super important for young people to be able to process.
We've got to give the stage to the next group, but let's do one more quick one.
Hi, I'm Molly from ABC. My question is, this is the first presidential election that we're seeing in the post-Me Too movement. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about how you think that might cut across these different groups that we've been discussing, in particular with millennials, when you say we have such a high bar in terms of spin and being able to cut that out quickly.
I think that there is, it's a complicated issue, and there is I think, deep sense of relief amongst young people and young women in particular that things are being called to attention that they aren't necessarily going to have to navigate through in a difficult way. I don't think any woman hasn't been on the receiving end of some of these challenges that are being surfaced right now. And so I do think the tolerance for it is lower for accepting behavior and moving on. And I say that hoping that we don't have a repeat of some very real misogynistic behavior being released a month before the election, and everyone sort of says, well, that's men.
Yeah, I would say that, and I think we're starting to see that a little bit in the conversation about Joe Biden. And you're seeing, what concerns me a little bit is this idea among Democrats that the only thing that can beat Donald Trump is someone who's kind of like Donald Trump. And I think we saw this in the terribly misguided Michael Avenatti period, where Michael Avenatti went to New Hampshire and people were like, he should run for president. And then he most certainly should not. No, that went poorly. But I do think that this is a conversation we need to keep having, and you're starting to hear from some Democrats who are supportive of Joe Biden, who, by the way, has not announced he's running for president. That like, well, what's a little hair sniffing when it's, when you have to save the republic from Donald Trump? And that's something that concerns me, this idea of like, well, like we can't, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm a little concerned that, in this kind of this era in which more people have felt comfortable sharing how, sexual harassment and sexual assault are real crises in our society. I'm concerned that there are going to be people saying like, well, Donald Trump's a real crisis. And so this idea that sexual harassment and sexual assault will be weighed and measured based on how important it is to defeat a particular political figure. But I think that that's going to be a particular challenge. And you're already starting to see that in how people are even trying to handle what people are saying or what people have seen from Joe Biden.
One thing to keep in mind on that is that there's a gender gap in every conceivable group, right? No matter what you look at, women are more likely to vote Democratic than men, blue-collar whites, African, it doesn't matter. But among millennials in the last, or people born after 1980, in the last election, it is a chasm. I mean, the Pew research, it is almost unimaginable how big the gap is between millennial women and millennial men. We're talking about 40 points in party ID, which is, just, so, there's something happening in terms of the way Trump is defining the Republican Party that is having a particular impact on younger women, much more than on younger men. And it is something to keep in mind as you kind of go forward in the coverage.
These candidates are going to have to navigate this on their own, but I do think we tend to think of the electorate as being stupid or underinformed, and like I really want to push back on that. What is happening with Joe Biden is a real thing that's out there, and the voters are going to decide whether that was the same tantamount to the assault that we're like seeing people deal with and take repercussions for or not. And I think we have to let people decide right now where that is. And so I would just say not to assume that everyone should be discounted based on a hard line.
Our decision is to leave the stage at this point. So listen, join me in thanking this terrific panel.
Thank you.